Every country has a past that seems to be embraced within their contemporary character, projected on both themselves and to the wider world. For the Nordic nations of Sweden and Norway, it's their Viking ancestry. For Japan, it's their feudal period with tales of the samurai. For England, it's their history of kings and queens, with knights clad in armor. While for the United States, it is their tales of the Wild West. We all have an idea of what the Wild West was like, with visions of gunfights in the streets between heroes and villains, cattle trains thundering across open plains, bandits leaping on trains to rob its passengers, and enduring animosity between the white settlers and the indigenous peoples. All of it has been ingrained in the public consciousness after decades of movies, books, and legends of the Old West portraying it as such. But, like all tall tales told throughout history, we have to question how much truth there is in the popular perception of this fascinating and crucial period of American history. In this documentary, we are going to examine the true history of the Old West and study how its influence has helped define the culture of the modern American nation. This is the story of the real Wild West. In the early 1770s, Britain controlled swaths of territory along the eastern seaboard of North America, organized into 13 distinct colonies. These colonies enjoyed a high degree of self-determination and intercolonial cooperation in trade, leading to the colonists losing their sense of identity as British and instead identifying as Americans. This naturally evolved into friction between the colonies and Britain until 1775, when the American colonists were in an open revolt. On July 4, 1776, the colonists formally declared themselves an independent nation and a new country was born, the United States of America. For the people of this new country, the dream of freedom extended beyond being tied to the British Empire. It was a promise of cultural reform where any man could seek to better his prospects through hard work under the protection of law which granted justice for all. The dream was infectious, and immigration to the United States from Europe by people looking for a better life saw the population skyrocket from just 5 million in 1800 to 23 million in 1850. However, very quickly that dream began to sour. The fact of the matter was that while the 13 states had political independence, culturally they inherited many of the old class systems which made it all but impossible for the lower classes to get a foothold in business and politics. Disillusioned, they began to look to the largely unexplored territory to the west, with the idea of establishing new settlements, which could one day grow into new cities, and eventually, new states. With their fresh start, the settlers believed they could finally find their fortunes. However, the Old World was still proving a hindrance to achieving this destiny. Britain was not the only imperial power to seize land in North America, as both France and Spain had legal claims to thousands of miles of land under laws recognized by the Christian nations. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States and recognized that France's once ambitious plan for a French empire in North America was slowly falling apart. Sensing an opportunity, he entered into a series of negotiations to purchase French territory to the west of the still infant United States. This would allow France to withdraw from North America whilst maintaining a degree of honor, rather than lose it in a future military confrontation with Spain, Britain, or even the new United States. Concluded in a ceremony on December 20th, 1803, the impact of what history remembers as the Louisiana Purchase on the North American map was enormous. In literally the stroke of a quill, the United States doubled in size and made westward expansion possible without incurring the wrath of the French. Included in the deal was the Mississippi River, which would become a major artery for American commerce and provided a considerable boost to the economic development of the United States at a time when the first American railroads were still almost 30 years away. The door was opening to the west. The acquisition of this huge area of land would help give rise to the concept of manifest destiny amongst many Americans. Coined in 1845, this was the philosophical notion that the people of the United States, specifically those of a white Christian denomination, were destined by God to expand their dominion across the untamed land to the west, spreading democracy, capitalism, and of course Christianity, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was this belief that granted the American peoples the moral authority to disregard the historical territorial claims of the Native American population, who were regarded as inferior savages standing in the way of American destiny. First, of course, the American government had to chart the new lands. Shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, President Jefferson commissioned an expedition westward to explore and map the new territory and find a practical route to the Pacific Ocean for future expeditions and settlements. Led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the expedition took over 3 years to complete and gave the American people an idea of what awaited them to the west. Meanwhile, to the south and west, the Spanish Empire, which occupied territories in Florida, Texas, and California, saw the Lewis and Clark expedition as a real threat and even sent a military force to apprehend them, but ultimately failing. In response, 5th U.S. President James Monroe warned European nations not to interfere with American expansion to the west, making a formal declaration that they intended to settle as far as the Pacific Ocean, and that further encroachment on the American continent by Europeans would be seen as an act of war. As well as the old empires, the threat was also aimed against Mexico, which had gained its independence from Spain and taken Texas and California with it. Texas would eventually gain its independence from Mexico in 1836 and petitioned to join the United States in 1845. Meanwhile, America and Great Britain sought to draw a border between the expanded U.S. lands and British Canada, concluding in a treaty in 1846 which allowed President James K. Polk to instead focus on acquiring California from Mexico after Florida was granted statehood in 1845. Mexico and the United States erupted into war on April 25, 1846, and was a major military victory for the Americans. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the fighting in 1848, added an additional 525,000 square miles of territory to the U.S., including the modern-day states of California, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. The map of the United States we know today was just now taking shape. But of course, these weren't just empty areas of land meant for seizing. When Europeans ventured to new lands such as Africa, Asia, and America, they employed the doctrine of discovery, which disregarded territorial claims by the local populations and instead granted immediate sovereignty of the new land to the European explorers. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Johnson v. McIntosh that this recognized international legal principle used by European settlers was also applicable to the United States as it pushed west and encountered native peoples. It also meant that the local tribespeople were subjects of the U.S. government, albeit in a purely administrative capacity, rather than becoming equal citizens. This also prevented the native peoples from exercising any rights as an independent nation, and could not have any more dealings with foreign nations without first sparking war with the U.S. While American settlers moved west, believing it was their God-given right to claim the new lands, the indigenous populations didn't see it that way. They saw it for what it was, an invasion and the destruction of their way of life, and armed conflict was inevitable, frequent, and bloody. Recognizing the threat, some tribes even banded together to face the U.S. Army and armed settlers who appeared hell-bent on destroying them, both militarily and culturally. However, the technologically superior U.S. forces were victorious again and again. Tribes that didn't resist found their hunting and farming lands being restricted, or in some cases, were forced to relocate entirely, often because they lived on a patch of land ideal for white settlers. In short, the conflict and forced relocation was akin to ethnic cleansing. The expansion of the American settlers, many of whom had themselves emigrated from Europe, also greatly increased the exposure of diseases to Native American populations, for which they did not have any natural immunity. Measles and smallpox especially devastated local tribes, as not only were they fatal but highly infectious. For some of the more cynical American settlers, they saw these diseases running rampant and killing thousands as a sign from God, clearing the land for them to claim. It is difficult to imagine what must have gone through the minds of those who chose to risk it all for the dream of finding a better life in the untamed lands out west. It would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that in the 19th century, those undertaking the wagon trains were carrying out a journey akin to colonizing the moon today. They would be almost totally alone, with little or no governmental, medical, or logistical support. After the first pioneers pushed through the lands largely on their own wits, or as a part of exploratory expeditions, such as that undertaken by Lewis and Clark, Routes were established that would lead them into the heart of the new territories before they would branch off into new areas to establish their settlements. Some of the most well-known routes included the Santa Fe Trail, which ran from the Missouri River along the divide between the tributaries of the Arkansas and Kansas rivers, to the site of the Great Bend in Kansas, where it then turned along the Arkansas River before branching southwest to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Another trail of great importance was the Oregon-California Trail. No trail was ever considered easy, but the Oregon-California Trail was particularly difficult, involving obstacle-ridden terrain that included large territories still occupied by Native Americans. It began in Independence, Missouri, before traversing northeastern Kansas, southern Nebraska, and southern Wyoming. It then crossed the first of 3 towering mountain ranges, before heading across the arid and desolate Great Divide Basin and stretching through Idaho before finally reaching the territory of Oregon. Given the danger involved, folks needed experienced frontiersmen who could teach and lead sometimes thousands of settlers at a time, many of whom had grown up in American or European cities and had little experience living off the land. In addition, it became necessary for the settlers to form large wagon trains for cooperative protection and support. The types of people who joined the wagon trains varied greatly from wagon to wagon. Some were sold on the tales of adventure, conceiving images of battling bears or the native people and earning glory for themselves in the process. Others were businessmen, hoping to take their skills and acumen to the new settlements where the competition was less fierce, and they could establish a monopoly before the settlements grew. And of course, some were criminals escaping the law, or those who had accumulated debts that they couldn't pay, and they were fleeing west to escape the sometimes violent debt collectors. A wagon train would begin to form in early spring at an agreed-upon rendezvous point, such as near the Missouri River. Before setting out, the members of the train would start to form groups amongst their numbers to serve vital functions during the course of the journey. They would also establish a governing body. They would elect leaders and then decide on rules of conduct during the journey. Those tasked with scouting ahead of the main train, or who were charged with protecting it from attack, would travel on their own horses, allowing them to move about quickly. The majority of the train's population would ride in the now iconic Conestoga wagons. The wagons took their name from the Conestoga Creek region of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where they originated and were ideally suited for hauling freight over rough terrain. Pulled by up to 6 horses, the wagon had a carrying capacity of up to 6 tons, and the floor curved up at each end to prevent the contents from shifting inside on uneven ground, while a distinctive white canvas cover protected against rain and provided shade from the heat. Once organized and on their way, wagon trains tended to follow a fairly strict daily routine. Typically, those embarking with the train would wake up at 4 a.m. for breakfast and packing before setting off at 7 a.m., not stopping until around 4 p.m., where they would set up camp for the evening. It was always rough going, too. Some days, as little as just 3 miles would be traversed by the wagon trains, an often depressing result, as everyone in the wagon train knew. With each passing day, winter drew closer. It was not just the terrain that hindered their progress, however. Some wagon trains would have in excess of 100 wagons amongst them, and getting such a huge convoy moving was an extraordinary challenge for their leaders. Of course, there was also the threat from the Native American tribes, who often tracked the long lines of wagons snaking through the territory that their ancestors had lived on for millennia. Sometimes the tribes would stop the wagon trains and demand they pay tribute to them in the form of food, mules, rifles, or other goods. The wagon trains could pay or decide to fight them off, but neither guaranteed their safety. Some of the more aggressive tribes wouldn't even demand tribute. They would just simply attack. Defending the wagon trains was a difficult undertaking. It was often so long that those charged with protecting it were spread thinly across its length. And when an attack did come, every able-bodied person was involved in the defense, even if it was just by reloading the next rifle and allowing the shooter to keep firing at the attacking tribesmen. Some wagon trains adopted specialized tactics for dealing with attacks. When traveling through an area known for attacks, the wagon trains would often travel in 2 columns rather than a single file. This way, when an attack came, they would quickly form a circular defensive line. Finally, as if the terrain, the incoming winter weather, and the threat of attack weren't enough, the populations of the wagon trains also had to contend with disease and hunger as time went on. On the Oregon-California Trail, cholera ravaged through many wagon trains and was all the more frightening by the suddenness of the disease taking hold. It was said that a man or woman could feel perfectly fine at breakfast and be dead by supper. The lack of fresh fruits on the trail also saw a marked degradation in overall health, due to the lack of essential vitamins, leading to some people even getting scurvy, a disease more commonly associated with sailors on long sea voyages. For some wagon trains, hunger became such an issue that there was only one option left open. In 1846, a wagon train known as the Donner Party was trapped in the harsh winters of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. They would survive by eating the flesh of those who had already perished. After all of these factors are considered, it comes as no surprise that those who completed these trails were considered the toughest of men and women. They embodied the American spirit that had led to the Pilgrims colonizing North America in the first place, and now they were expanding the reach of their country and their way of life. The legend of the Old West and the heroic frontier folk who forged it were already beginning to form stories of the experiences on the trails, filtering back east and leading to greater interest in moving out west amongst the remaining population. But not everybody was cut out for the wagon trains. In 1930, the first U.S. railroad opened, and over the coming decades, the number of miles of railroad increased exponentially. Out west, the earlier wagon trains established settlements, and the railroads were soon opening them up to more travelers looking to find new, more prosperous lives. The hundreds of people who went by wagon soon became thousands of people going by steam train, especially after gold was found in California in 1848. Over the coming decades, the settlements swelled into towns and cities to serve the gold mines, or act as rest stops for trains or cattle drives. The stage was set for the period history would remember as the Wild West. The choice of where to establish settlements varied from place to place, and the names of some of these settlements would become ingrained in the wider legend of the Old West. The real town of Deadwood, for example, was established in 1876 in an area of South Dakota previously promised to the Lakota tribe. However, when gold was found in the nearby Black Hills, American settlers disregarded this treaty and founded the town, taking the name from a formation of dead trees found nearby. Meanwhile, the town of Tombstone was founded almost concurrently to Deadwood in Cochise County, Arizona. The town was centered around a series of silver mines around the area, and over the course of 10 years, it produced somewhere in the region of $50 million of revenue, an extraordinary figure for the day. Some settlements would grow beyond small townships and evolve over time to become some of America's most prominent cities. A small settlement established in 1858 on the banks of the South Platte River during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush was the beginning of the city of Denver, Colorado. Gold would also turn the small West Coast town of San Francisco into a thriving city after fortune hunters flocked there to capitalize on the California Gold Rush. Beginning in 1849, the new citizens of San Francisco became known as 49ers, a name which would later be adopted by the city's National Football League team in honor of this period of the city's history. Given America's state and federal legal systems, there was little in the way of regulation to control many of these Wild West towns, and anyone with the money to build a business was usually free to do so. During its heyday, the comparatively affluent town of Tombstone had no less than 110 saloons, 14 gambling halls, numerous dance halls, brothels, 4 churches, 3 newspapers,